Okay, in part 2 of the lectures on trauma and stressor-related disorders, we're going to talk about acute stress disorder and post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. And we're going to talk about these two disorders side by side, because as you'll soon discover, there's a lot of overlap between them, and the thing that differentiates them is particularly time, so how long symptoms persist. So overall, acute stress disorder and post-traumatic stress disorder are diagnosed when a person develops characteristic symptoms following exposure to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violation in one or more of the following ways: directly experiencing the traumatic event, witnessing in person the event as it occurred to others, learning that the event occurred to a close family member or close friend, and in this case, the DSM-5 specifies that in cases of actual or threatened death of a family member or friend, the event must have been violent or accidental, and experiencing repeated or extreme exposure to aversive details of the traumatic event. And in this case, the DSM-5 stipulates that this exposure to aversive details does not apply to exposure through electronic media, television, movies, or pictures, unless this exposure is work-related. And when the DSM-5 says traumatic events, what's included in this category could be things like exposure to war as a combatant or civilian, threatened or actual violent personal assaults, natural and human-made disasters, severe accidents, and sudden or catastrophic medical incidents. Now, the event doesn't have to fall into one of these categories. These are just examples the DSM-5 gives to give a scope of the severity of events that could result in a person developing symptoms of PTSD or acute stress disorder. One important thing to note, which we've talked about in class before, is that interpersonal traumas, so traumas caused by other people, like rape, combat experience, abuse, or assault, are all associated with a higher risk for developing symptoms than are natural disasters. And the thinking behind this is that interpersonal violence ends up being more traumatic because it challenges people's core schemas regarding human nature. Now, in terms of the types of symptoms that people may experience, the DSM-5 describes 5 different categories: intrusive symptoms, avoidance symptoms, negative alterations in cognitions and mood, arousal and reactivity symptoms, or dissociative symptoms. And we'll go through each of these categories. So first, we'll talk about intrusive symptoms. And intrusive symptoms are things like recurrent, involuntary, and intrusive distressing memories of the traumatic event, recurrent distressing dreams in which the content and/or affect of the dream are related to the event, dissociative reactions like flashbacks in which the individual feels or acts as if the traumatic event were reoccurring, intense or prolonged psychological distress or marked physiological reactions in response to internal or external cues that symbolize or resemble an aspect of the traumatic event. Next are avoidance symptoms, which include symptoms such as efforts to avoid distressing memories, thoughts or feelings about or closely associated with the traumatic event, or efforts to avoid external reminders that arouse distressing memories, thoughts, or feelings about or closely associated with the traumatic event. And the reminder can be any number of things: peoples, places, conversations, objects, situations. Any of that could cause the arousal of distressing memories. Negative alterations in cognitions and mood look a little different for PTSD versus acute stress disorder. For PTSD, the symptoms that fall under this category include things like persistent inability to experience positive emotions, inability to remember an important aspect of the traumatic event, typically due to dissociative amnesia and not to other factors such as head injury, alcohol, or drugs, persistent and exaggerated negative beliefs or expectations about oneself, others, or the world, persistent distorted cognitions about the cause or consequences of the traumatic event that lead the individual to blame himself or herself or others, persistent negative emotional state, so feeling fear, horror, anger, guilt, or shame persistently, marked diminished interest or participation in significant activities, or feelings of detachment or estrangement from others. For acute stress disorder, however, the only possible symptom that falls under this heading is the persistent inability to experience positive symptoms. So while it's possible that the person might experience any of these other dissociative symptoms, they're not considered one of the symptoms that mark acute stress disorder. The fourth category of symptoms is arousal and reactivity symptoms, and this includes things like sleep disturbance, which could include nightmares, hypersomnia or hyposomnia, irritable behavior or angry outbursts with little or no provocation, and often this takes the shape as verbal or physical aggression towards people or objects. Hypervigilance, which is defined as an enhanced state of sensory sensitivity accompanied by an exaggerated intensity of behaviors whose purpose is to detect threats. Problems with concentration, exaggerated startle response, and reckless or self-destructive behavior. And last are dissociative symptoms, which are actually only relevant for acute stress disorder. And these include experiencing an altered sense of the reality of one's surroundings or oneself, which we call depersonalization or derealization. So for example, you could think about someone sort of seeing themselves from another one person's perspective, or being in a daze or feeling as though time is slowing down, or an inability to remember an important aspect of the traumatic event. So typically, again, due to dissociative amnesia and not to other factors. So in order for someone to be diagnosed with PTSD, he or she must experience at least one intrusive symptom, at least one avoidance symptom, at least 2 negative alterations in cognitions and mood, and at least 2 changes in arousal and reactivity. For acute stress disorder, however, the person must experience at least 9 symptoms from any of the 5 categories, beginning or worsening after the traumatic event occurred. What is more, for both post-traumatic stress disorder and acute stress disorder, the disturbance or symptoms must cause clinically significant distress or impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of functioning, and the disturbance or symptoms cannot be attributable to the physiological effects of a substance or another medical condition. So up to this point, you might be thinking, wow, PTSD and acute stress disorder sound really similar. What differentiates them? And I'm glad you asked that, because as I mentioned at the beginning of the lecture, the thing that differentiates PTSD from acute stress disorder is primarily time. So whereas for PTSD, the symptoms have to last more than 1 month, for acute stress disorder, the symptoms have to last for less than 1 month, specifically from 3 days to 1 month after the trauma exposure. In addition, if you remember, I mentioned that dissociative symptoms are only relevant for acute stress disorder. And the reason for that is that the creators of the DSM decided instead to use a specifier to capture dissociative symptoms for folks with PTSD. So we can specify PTSD as with dissociative symptoms, meaning that the individual's symptoms meet the criteria for PTSD. And in addition, in response to the stressor, the individual experiences persistent or recurrent symptoms of depersonalization and or derealization. And what we mean by depersonalization is persistent or recurrent experiences of feeling detached from, and as if one were an outside observer of, one's mental processes or body. Derealization, on the other hand, is persistent or recurrent experiences of feeling that one's surroundings aren't real. Further, there's an additional specifier of PTSD called with delayed expression, in which the person doesn't meet full diagnostic criteria until at least 6 months after the event, even though some of the symptoms are present before then. I know this is a lot of information to remember, so one of the mnemonic devices that has been developed to help people remember symptoms of PTSD is dreams. So detachment, re-experiencing the event, that the event has emotional effects, the person avoids certain reminders of the event, the symptoms last for at least 1 month in duration, and the person experiences sympathetic hyperactivity or hypervigilance. Now, in terms of prevalence, rates vary widely. Let's talk about acute stress disorder first. What we know is that less than 20% of people who experience a trauma that's not interpersonal in nature end up meeting criteria for acute stress disorder. And those rates seem to vary depending upon the type of trauma. So between 6 and 12% of people who are involved in industrial accidents seem to meet criteria. About 10% of people who experience severe burns. About 13 to 21% of people who are involved in severe motor vehicle accidents. And about 14% of people who experience some form of mild traumatic brain injury, though depending upon the cause of the TBI, these rates can vary considerably. However, as I noted before, when the trauma is interpersonal in nature, the rates skyrocket, and it's hard to pin these numbers down just because a lot of people don't report symptoms or seek help. However, estimates suggest that between 20 and 50% of people who experience some type of interpersonal trauma, like assault, rape, or witnessing a mass shooting, likely meet diagnostic criteria for acute stress disorder. We have much more reliable stats on folks who experience PTSD, in part because the symptoms last longer, which often leads people to seek out help more often. So overall, what we know is that for U.S. adults, there's about an 8.7 projected lifetime risk for PTSD before age 75. For a variety of factors, most likely because women are so much more likely to be assaulted than men, the data suggests that women are about twice as likely as men to meet diagnostic criteria for PTSD. What research has shown is that the most common causes of PTSD are the sudden, unexpected death of a loved one, or rape, though rates of PTSD due to combat are certainly increasing. And what we see is that Latinos, African Americans, and Native Americans are much more likely than white Americans to meet criteria for PTSD, likely because of the systematic oppression and discrimination that makes individuals from these racial and ethnic backgrounds much more likely to experience overt and covert forms of trauma. In terms of etiology, we know that by definition, the cause of PTSD and acute stress disorder is the experiencing or witnessing of a traumatic event. However, as your book mentions, research has also suggested that for PTSD in particular, individuals with smaller hippocampi may be more likely to develop PTSD in response to trauma as a result of restricted abilities to organize memories and place them in context. And this hypothesized cause of PTSD actually serves as the basis for the development of one of the more recent preventative treatments called critical incident stress debriefing. The idea being that if we can help people process traumatic experiences soon after they occur, then they're less likely to encode those memories in a faulty way. So what critical incident stress debriefing tries to do is to have people talk through the trauma and then put causes and feelings to that narrative. And this is being used more and more, particularly in the military. However, as your book mentions, the research on its effectiveness is somewhat lacking because, as you can imagine, it's impossible to ethically do experimental research on it. So best practice in the treatment of acute stress disorder and post-traumatic stress disorder is cognitive behavioral therapy. There's actually been a specific kind of cognitive behavioral therapy developed called trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, which has the client write out the story of their trauma and talk through all the pieces of it. And that serves as a form of what your book calls imaginal exposure. And the idea is that part of what ends up maintaining symptoms of PTSD are the avoidance symptoms. So by avoiding thinking about the event, similar to what happens with phobias, the person doesn't have the chance to challenge the memories and work through them. So by exposing the person to the event, you provide an opportunity for people to work through those memories and associated feelings. Eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, or EMDR, has also been shown to be an effective treatment for PTSD. An EMDR involves 8 steps, which include having the client visualize an image that represents the disturbing event, and then describing negative cognitions associated with the image. The client is also asked to create positive cognitions that could be associated with the same image that over time will come to replace the negative cognitions. And over the course of treatment, the client is asked to visualize the image while they're receiving bilateral stimulation, which can include following a moving light by shifting your eyes from side to side or tapping on the right knee versus the left knee. And what research has shown is that because our minds aren't able to truly hold 2 ideas in mind at once, by focusing on the bilateral stimulation, the image loses its power and the negative cognitions can then be replaced with positive cognitions. And finally, there's been some evidence that pharmacotherapy, specifically treatment with SSRIs, can be helpful in alleviating some symptoms. However, as with most disorders, a combination of medications and psychotherapy is more effective than medication alone. So that's the end of your online lecture on acute stress disorder and PTSD. Now go ahead and take the quiz in preparation for Monday's class. See you then.